So happy to be here and to be welcoming Bret Stephens for the first time at Central Synagogue. It's really such a gift to have you here. And to talk about many things on our mind. I know that for this crowd, you really don't need an introduction, but I want to share a few things. Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's worked for the Wall Street Journal. He was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and now an opinion columnist for the New York Times. He just told me that since the year began, he's already written 50 articles. I know that you've read many of them and shared them as well. But writing about foreign policy, domestic politics, cultural issues. And in addition, he's also the editor-in-chief of the relatively new Sapir Journal, which is an excellent journal I highly recommend, exploring the future of the American Jewish community and its intersection with cultural, social, and political issues. I also find it notable that you, Bret, you buck all journalistic trends by studiously avoiding all social media. You cannot find him on Twitter or X. And that you also engage publicly in a weekly conversation on current affairs with what I would call your Hevruta, your friend, colleague, and sparring partner, Gail Collins, which people love. I think it's the most popular on the Times. And I think these two acts say so much about you. The fact that you are studiously avoiding the kind of sound bites that are encouraged by Twitter, and that you also regularly engage across difference through debating in a very civil and beautiful way, which is a profound discipline for our time. Bret has written extensively on the importance of free speech, safeguarding democracy, and on Middle East policy, making him the very perfect person to kick off our Hineini series on civic engagement, democracy, and Jewish life. So Bret, thank you so much for joining us in this inaugural session entitled Hineini, Here I Am. Hineini appears in the Torah to indicate pivotal moments that provide a call for awareness and engagement. This is a time of, I think, I don't have to say, a lot of anxiety in this country, and maybe particularly for the Jewish community. And Central Synagogue wants all of us to engage, not just in the issues of our day, but the profound impact that our Jewish values will have on our larger nation. Our clergy and guest educators over the course of the next 6 months will focus on the intersection of civic issues and Jewish life, and we hope that wherever you find yourself on the political spectrum, and I know at Central we cover all of it, that we will feel committed to the values that have shaped our country and connected to action to secure these values so that we will be able to learn and listen from people whose views we do not always share. I'm really grateful that one of my Hevruta in this community is David Moore, and he has been someone who helps sharpen my thinking and challenges me, and I'm also particularly grateful that he and Lori Moore have sponsored this evening talk with Bret Stephens, so thank you. I hope that this conversation, in addition to the series that we will hope you will continue with us, will help renew our faith in democracy, our willingness to work to strengthen the institutions that support it and are vital to its success. So these are lofty goals, but as Rabbi Tarfon said, we do not have to finish the task, but we must persist at it. So I'm going to engage in a few questions first with Bret, and I know he's very good at talking, but I will also encourage those of you who are here, if you would like to if you have a question, that you can write it on a card, which I believe are around, or we'll be passing them around, and at some point we will collect them up as we go along, maybe about 30 minutes in, and Rabbi Joy Levitt will share some of those questions with me, I hope, so at the end we can take some of your questions as well. I don't think we're going to have trouble with thinking of things to ask. So, as you could hear from the response in the room, Bret, many people in the room and around the world know you best from your dialogue with Gail Collins, which I think is the Times' most popular column. You're a conservative, maybe I can label you that. She's a liberal. Can you tell us the idea for how this column was created and how you managed to model civil dialogue while seemingly being at odds with each other on most issues? Have either of you changed your mind as a result of this dialogue? Has it led to better understanding and respect for each other's positions? How can we learn from that?
You know, the column existed in a somewhat attenuated form before I got to the Times. Gail had tried it with other
Hevrutas?
Partners. And it hadn't quite taken off because it requires a certain amount of chemistry, and we had it, it turned out. It requires a state of mind. The way I think about it is, imagine playing a game of tennis, but not for points. You're not trying to ace your opponent, get in a killer shot. You don't even care all that much if the ball is in the line, within the lines. You just want to keep the ball in the air. And that's what we really try to do. And both of us comment that the most popular thing we do at the Times is the easiest thing that we do. I mean, it's really not difficult, and we try not to invest too much mental energy in it. I mean, I don't go searching for data, you know, to back up my points or quotes. Sometimes I'll need. She likes having me recite poems at the end, so sometimes I'll have to make sure that I remember these poems that my father forced me to memorize as a kid accurately. But what has struck us is that if you look for the column on social media, it's nowhere. It has no traction on Twitter or anywhere else. And yet, if you look at our metrics in the Times, they're stratospheric. And I think that's because social media is built on algorithms that are essentially designed for outrage. And we're just not part of that algorithm. And I think there is an immense appetite for the art of disagreeing agreeably. I think there's an appetite for humor and for maybe the ideal that we're still one country, we can still talk to one another across party lines, and we don't need to judge one another morally by where we stand politically. I mean, I guess in the most extreme cases you do, but we can at least widen that window so that we like each other when we come into the conversation, and we like each other when we go out. And we're friends in real life. We get together and drink and gossip about our crazy colleagues at the Times.
I love that, but can I probe a little bit more, because I think that is an ideal, and obviously you're starting from a baseline of trusting that this other person is a good, fundamentally good human being, which I think is necessary. But are there issues which have felt so deep and perhaps the stakes so high, and there's been a lot of them recently, and maybe where you have felt, you know, kind of different level of anxiety or fear around them, in which it feels like you actually need to change her mind, or that where the temperature has ever risen? Because I'm trying to think about why these kinds of conversations break down between people who love each other and trust each other, which we've seen so much in the last 6-7 months. Families talking about conversations they can't have between even children and grandchildren. And so when you do already love each other and think you're good people, what do you do when those conversations feel so loaded or so heated that you feel that what's at stake is you must change someone's mind? Or is that not the right stance?
Well, Gail in this case makes it easy for me, because there's only one topic that is so sensitive for me that I would have trouble maintaining a dialogue. Gail just doesn't like talking about foreign policy. So she makes it, in our immediate case, it solves the problem. Although after October 7th, I was so heartbroken that the idea of engaging even in a lighthearted conversation about other subjects seemed impious, if you will, or it seemed wrong. And so I just asked Gail, I said, I need a month off. I can't have this kind of everyday banter when what just happened is unfolding. It's a very good question. I am friends with long-standing friendship with now a colleague named Megan Stack, whose views are very different from my own. And I have gone out of my way to praise her work, including on issues that I don't agree with, because I think it's fair and strong work. I do my best to expand the window of conversations as far as I can. But for instance, I used to be, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say this, but why not? Peter Beinart and I used to be sort of the twiddly-dee and twiddly-dum of debates and You'd appear here and there. And I know Peter is a perfectly nice guy. I know his wife. I've done a favor for his son. I even appeared on his podcast about a year ago. He asked it, as a favor. After October 7th, I couldn't. And maybe this speaks ill of me, but I just said to myself, I'm never appearing on stage with him again. So there is a line.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry that, to my mind, he crossed it. He probably feels the same way about me.
I think what's hard about these conversations is we can do this when it doesn't feel like what feels like it's at stake feels existential for us. And I think when it does, it becomes much, much more challenging. You've written about reclaiming a center, which I think that we are hearing, as you said, these algorithms, play out the outrage. And frankly, I'd say it's not just on social media, but even regular media seems to play up to the extremes more. And finding our way back to a center, to a set of once cherished understandings of our national identity. Our differences don't erase a shared sense of citizenship and an overarching sense of common destiny. And you quote President Clinton in his first inaugural speech when he said, "There is nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what is right in America." You said all of this in 2020. Do you still believe it? I was
thinking as you were saying that, so that sounds like me, but I can't quite place it.
Do you still believe that? And can you point to some examples of how this can be done, 4 years and arguably much more polarization later?
Well, I think that to varying degrees, both parties have been captured by a kind of illiberalism that I reject. And by illiberalism, I don't mean like the opposite of Nancy Pelosi. I mean like the opposite of democracy and the values that inform democratic life. And I've seen that unfold, I think, on both sides. I left the Wall Street Journal because I was a dedicated never-Trumper, even though, as far as I'm concerned, the highest tax rate should be about 15%. But, that probably scandalizes most of you in this room. I was a, economic conservative, but I parted company with the party. And then I find myself equally alienated from large parts of the left that aren't interested in dialogue, that are shot through with a kind of anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism. But I think that the values that are now presenting themselves as increasingly mainstream values in both parties are antithetical to the core of the American creed. And I think of the American creed as that set of values that brought my mother here when she was 10 as a displaced person who had been in hiding during the Holocaust in Nazi-occupied Europe. I think of it as Harry Truman vetoing the first Displaced Persons Act because it was overtly discriminatory against Catholics and Jews. I think of American values in this way. We believe that what ultimately matters about us is in fact the content of our character, and that's how we ought to judge ourselves and ought to judge other people. We believe that free speech isn't just for me, it's also for you, emphatically including when you have views that are wildly offensive to me. We believe in free enterprise. We believe in a system that allows you to create, grow, and profit from your creations. We believe in a whole architecture of rights to defend the presumption of innocence. By the way, one of the things that I've been very upset about in the last 7 or 8 years is the way in which we are in the court of public opinion condemning people who have not been who have only been accused in random sort of drive-by internet accusations and are having their lives ruined. And this has maybe even happened to people in this room or certainly to people that you know. So those core sets of ideals that Clinton spoke about, nothing that is, everything that's wrong can be cured by what's right in America. I think that's still true, and I think that there is, to borrow a phrase, a silent majority of Americans who subscribe to it. The tragedy is we have a political system which keeps imposing the worst versions of ourselves at the farthest extremes on everyone else. And I think part of that problem is technology, the amplification of extreme voices through social media, but the other part is a kind of a quiescent and somewhat cowed center that doesn't really want to speak up for its own values and its own sense of what civic life should look like. And that takes people whose lives are not fundamentally engaged in our civic, in its civic dimensions, to actually make the effort to devote more of their life to that, to just having a different kind of conversation and to insisting that those are the conversations that will happen in the institutions they support, the universities they sponsor, and so on.
So I want to dig into that because I think that's actually the heart of it. It's that I do also believe that there is a vast majority of Americans who don't feel the extremes that are being amplified, and yet for some reason there is just a quiet. And so what are one of the ways, how do we activate that center? How do we impassion that center to act? And why are they being quiet? What do you think is behind this majority that feels relatively silent?
Well, because the social penalties that you pay for being the one person who stands up in defense of an unpopular person are vast. And, Andrew Jackson said one man with courage makes a majority. Actually, not so much, right? I don't know if he said it, but assuming it's attributed to him, turns out, what I've observed one of the things that has happened to me when I have been in an S storm on the center of a storm on social media is lots of nice people with huge followers write me privately and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry what's happening to you is happening. Really awful. It's so unfair. It's ridiculous." Do they say that on social media? Do they marshal their army of followers to say this is absurd? And what I've experienced, I know, has happened to other people. I think what we do to answer your first question comes down to a phrase. Actually, a friend of mine who's in the audience, Pamela Peresky, taught a course at the University of Chicago on the subject of habits of a free mind. And I love that phrase, the habits of a free mind, because it's not simply a matter of principles, it's also a matter of psychology. It's a matter of practice. Mm-hmm. What are the habits of the free mind? When you wake up in the morning, try to read someone you know you're not going to agree with, at least so you can understand for yourself why you don't agree with them. That would be a way of exercising a habit of a free mind, even if you have to grind your teeth through, whoever, Christoph or a Stevens column or whoever it is, right? Ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind on an important subject? And if it's been a while, why is that the case? Right. There's a wonderful line that I actually quoted in my first column that, a person who's right 51% of the time, that's a blessed person, right? But if you're right 90% of the time, you're a scoundrel, right? Because nobody is right 90% of the time. Just assume that you are right about only 60% of what you think you're right about, and you don't know what the 40% is. So your mind should at least be interrogating itself as to, well, where is it that I might be wrong? And the final thing is we need to engage in a form of listening that goes beyond merely what the other person is saying. And I'll just give you one example of this. I was this ardent never-Trumper. But in January, just as a thought exercise, I thought it was valuable not only for my audience, mostly liberal, but for me to write the case for Trump by someone who isn't, who wants him to lose. So it really forced me to try to attend to what the Trump case is and why tens of millions of Americans responded to that message. Because if you don't make that effort, you're not ultimately going to engage in any kind of meaningful argument with your opponent or be able to persuade your opponent because you're having totally separate conversations. So it's worth listening to other people. It's like one of those marital arguments where your spouse is so angry at some thing you did that what they're saying sounds, overblown or even ridiculous to you, but what they're communicating is perhaps significant. And so you have to kind of identify the signal amidst the noise. And I think too many of us have not tried to identify the signal amid the noise of what people on the other side of the aisle are saying.
Amen to that. And I would say I love the idea of habits of a free mind. I would also say it's the habits of a Jewish mind. Like it is, I think, Jewish practice in learning to always learn with someone else who is your sparring partner. It's literally what you're doing with Gail on a regular basis. But I think that the model that our ancestors set up for us is that you don't actually just surround yourself with people who think exactly the same as you do, who are yes men, and that you instead are constantly interrogating. And that's the only way that you sharpen and get closer to whatever truth is, which is not a fixed thing.
But, I would add, and this is maybe not contradictory, but paradoxical, you have to be able to do that while still holding on to a set of convictions that you really do believe in. And there's always this, I mean, one of the psychological tensions or even problems of being a columnist is that I write this column and I have to be extremely sure of what I'm saying, right? If I were this person in real life, I would be totally insufferable, right? So how do you maintain this kind of inner strain between conviction and a healthy self-skepticism? And that is an art. You have to have, to use sort of Jewish thought, in one pocket, the idea that exactly you're dust and ashes, on the other pocket, that the world was made for you, right? And something similar has to go on in the mind of, I think, any thoughtful person, which is that you have convictions and you attempt to hone them and defend them. At the same time, there has to be a voice of skepticism within you. And it's in that kind of dialogue within your soul that I think thoughtfulness really emerges.
Beautiful. You have been such a champion of free speech. You brought it up again here, that we have to be able to tolerate ideas that not only make us uncomfortable, maybe we find deeply offensive. I'd love for you to explore this in the context of recent campus protests and the sense of what you think should be allowable free speech in these instances, what veers into just hate speech and anti-Semitism and incitement and actual violence, which we also saw. But how do you draw these lines? How do you propose people think about this who are having to make decisions about the limits of free speech?
So I'm fairly close to a free speech absolutist. I mean, if they want to chant from the river to the sea, okay. I get to call that out as anti-Semitic as I see it. The problem I have is that campuses which have speech codes for other minorities seem to have adopted a free speech standard only when October 7th happened. And so free speech is a magnificent standard. It is a terrible double standard. And I particularly don't like it when it's used against, my group of folks. And I think that's what we saw after October 7th. The same people who came down like bricks on, a professor or a lecturer at Harvard who proposed that sex was biological. It was not, that this was inscribed into nature and essentially was shunted out of academia, suddenly discovered its free speech bona fides when Jews were being wantonly murdered, and that murder was being celebrated on campus. And I think that's what was so disturbing. Private, you know this as well as I do. Public universities have to accept the First Amendment as their standard. So if you're, University of Michigan, it's kind of an anything goes standard. If you're at Columbia, you can set rules. And my own belief is that the rules should be expansive and permissive. But that does not prevent the administration of Columbia for calling that speech out for what it is and for being clear-eyed about it. Nor does it prevent them from enforcing, and I think they should have enforced it much more severely, clear rules on time, place, and manner, right? I mean, this ought to be elementary, that your free speech cannot be conducted at the expense of the free speech or other sets of rights of other people. I don't like hate speech standards. We're not Canada, we're not Germany, we're the United States, and free speech ultimately serves not just the cause of freedom well, I think it ultimately serves the cause of tolerance well. I think we have a more tolerant society here in America because we have this absolutist standard than they do in, for instance, Germany. Because anytime you try to suppress thoughts, they don't disappear, they go underground. And they go underground in ways where they tend to,
mutate
to fester
and
mutate and go in awful directions. So I don't think the answer to what's happening at Columbia is to say, for example, well, we should include Jews in the sort of the DEI apparatus as a protected, category of people. I think that's ultimately counterproductive. I would just ask that as we apply a free speech standard or uphold a free speech standard for ourselves, we do it for others. And it's the double standard that really, I think, insults my intelligence and sense of fairness.
So I think I agree with you on all of this, and I would say that I appreciate that you could say they have the right to say that, we have the right to say that's anti-Semitism. I'm curious if you could help us talk a little bit about the fact that you've been public about the fact that you are not a fan of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that passed in the House the other week because it embraces an expansive definition of anti-Semitism known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition, which effectively criminalizes a wide range of speech. So maybe I already know the answer because you're an absolutist on free speech. But tell us more about...
I'm not an absolutist about it. There's
okay.
There's an exception to every rule.
But tell us more why you think this legislation, which is presumably to not only fight, but to help define anti-Semitism, which I think is a tricky thing because a lot of people really don't understand, beyond I hate Jews, there are a lot of people who really don't understand what anti-Semitism and the many forms it takes and the tropes that it masks behind. So tell us why you think that this legislation is dangerous or counterproductive?
Well, again, because I'm against essentially hate speech legislation of all kinds. This is just a position across the board. There is hateful speech that we can oppose in all kinds of ways, right? We can shun, we can sort of raise our voices against it. We can persuade people why something is hateful speech. I don't think the federal government should be in the business of making laws defining what certain forms of prohibited, proscribed speech should be. That's just a constitutional position. Now, when it comes to the IRA definition, many people who are usually on my side of the argument like it because it goes out of its way to point out that certain kinds of language about Israel is in fact anti-Semitic. It does it in the clunkiest way imaginable. It's this very, very lengthy definition. I think anti-Semitism can be defined in a single sentence, which satisfies all of our needs.
Tell us the sentence, so we'll know.
Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews are uniquely prone to use devious means to achieve malevolent ends and must therefore be opposed by all means necessary. That's one sentence. And what it captures, and this is an important aspect of it, to be an anti-Semite is more than just saying, Jews have big noses or whatever. Maybe we do, who cares, okay? Mm-hmm. I don't, but
I don't either.
So whatever. But anti-Semitism is a unique kind of prejudice because it's the only one that I'm aware of that operates as a conspiracy theory. It's not just a bigotry about Jews. It says that Jews are up to no good. And they're up to no good because it's somehow in their nature, either racially or religiously or culturally. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to do two things. They're trying to swindle, they're imposters. They're trying to fool you about who they really are. And they're swindlers. The 19th century anti-Semite would say that the Jew who claims to be a good, solid, say, German citizen, he's not German. He's a Semite, right? He's from the Middle East. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to swindle honorable Germans out of their patrimony and their wealth and their land and culture and so on. Now, what does the anti-Zionist say? He says Jews are imposters and swindlers. The Israeli claims to be, the Jewish Israeli claims to be ancestrally a native of the land of Israel, but he's really some Pole or, Brooklynite. Who knows, right? Or from Tacoma, someplace.
Imagine that.
And what's he trying to do, this Jew? He's trying to swindle the rightful owners of the land out of their patrimony. So the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism boils down to this. To the anti-Semite, at least the classic one, the Jew is a Middle Easterner. And to the anti-Zionist, the Jew is a European or a white person. But otherwise, they're identical. It's an identical conspiracy theory. And when you look at so much of the rhetoric that is used about Israel, it constantly plays on this idea that Jews are using devious means, control of the media, propaganda, hasbara, to achieve malevolent ends. What is that? Genocide. Therefore, resistance is justified. They must be opposed by all means necessary. This single sentence covers us. I don't want to make it into law, but it's a more efficient definition than the IRA definition.
So I'll ask you the question that I've been asked more than any other in the last few weeks. So what are we going to do about, what can we do about the prevailing attitudes we're seeing? I don't think it's representative of the majority of young people who are on college campuses, but it's a very loud minority. And I think that there were people who were protesting who don't carry anti-Semitic views or even necessarily anti-Zionist views. Some of them, I think, are legitimately pro-Palestinian without trying to be anti-Israel. But I think that the voices that we heard the most from are truly anti-Zionist, some anti-Semitic, some pro-Hamas, all of these things. So what do you imagine we could do to fight that without criminalizing the speech, without pushing down or criminalizing an anti-Semitism definition? What are some of the strategies you imagine that we should be going along to help change the situation?
So I don't think we can, quote, fight anti-Semitism. It's not our problem. Anti-Semitism is the problem of anti-Semites. And in the long run, there is no anti-Semitic society in history that hasn't been destroyed and crippled by its own hatreds. Interestingly, when you think about it, if Adolf Hitler had been a German leader in the mold of Wilhelm II, Germany would have won the war because the great base of scientific knowledge that ended up at Chicago and Los Alamos would have stayed, and the Germans would have beaten us in the race for an atomic bomb. It was his anti-Semitism that helped him lose the war.
I saw it in the movie. Yeah.
The correct response to anti-Semitism is Jewish pride. And I would say to all of you in this room, borrowing the book title called 10% Happier, be 10% Jewier. In whatever way you want. I used to joke I'm as minimally Jewish as you can get without being functionally Unitarian in terms of my religious observance. Well, now I'm lighting candles on Shabbat, right? And it more richly informs my philanthropic life, where I choose to spend my time. Just the energies of my life are, in my case, maybe more than 10%. But that, I think, is a reasonable baseline, not only for yourselves, but for your kids or grandchildren. Just 10% Jewier in any way you choose to be that. You have to have a sense, and I truly have this, that having had the kind of cosmic fortune to have been born into this extraordinary cultural, religious, psychological, well, I don't know about the psychological, the neurotic inheritance, that this is a great fortune in my life and important for me to pass on to my kids in some meaningful way. That, like being born very tall or strong, it's like a lucky thing to have happened that I was born into this. And it's more than just a sense of luck. It's also a sense of an obligation towards the past. So ancestrally on my mother's side, on my father's side we're schleppers from Kishinev, but my mother comes from a very distinguished rabbinical family. But my great-grandfather was the black sheep of the Grodzinski family. Some of you have heard of Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, big rabbi, ancient relative of mine. My grandfather, Israel, changed his name to Ivan, moved his family from Vilna to Moscow, he had, like me, a big mouth, said some untoward things about the Bolsheviks. That was that. He was arrested and never heard from again. Sent my great-grandmother and her 4 children into flight. One of those children died along the way. They ended up in Berlin until 1933. Then Hitler came to power. They went to Italy, and then the race laws happened in 1938. Then they were in hiding for, during the last years of the war. All of this suffering and agony on my mother's side and sacrifice so that in 1950 they could board a ship and come to America. And I am deeply conscious of the debt I owe my great-grandmother, who, with courage, I can, I become emotional thinking about what it would have meant when your husband has been arrested to get out of Moscow and run and run and run and be in exile from 3 different lands, that I have an obligation to uphold my end of this generational bargain and not to abandon what they sacrificed so much to give me.
Beautiful. I love your answer very much. It reflects a sermon I gave 2 high holidays ago around the antidote to anti-Semitism is more Jewish pride in the strongest sense of the word. So coming to you, central campaign, 10% Jewier. Okay, that's coming to you. But
I just came up with that.
I like it. I really like it.
Right?
It's catchy. But I want to push back a little bit because in some ways I do think, though, there is a bit of a cop-out that I don't actually think you believe that there's nothing we can do about anti-Semitism. And because, first of all, because I read your articles. You're fighting back on it all the time, actually. So you are doing something. And I think that they're part of our own Jewish pride and standing up for ourselves is at times being able to speak out against what we see as blatant anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean that we have to take out full-page ads in the newspaper, or I don't even know what the right strategies are, but I can't also abide the fact, and I don't think that it's our job to change anti-Semites, but I think a lot of people are not anti-Semites. I think they are regular people who hold some anti-Semitic ideas, and those are the people that I would like to work on or help them understand. So I might push back and say, really, you don't think that we can be doing anything about this and we shouldn't be? I mean, I don't think that that's, as much as I'm leaning into the joy of being Jewish, and that's my main job at Central, and as a rabbi, I also don't think that we can hold back from doing some of the pushing back against anti-Semitism.
One of the things when you're a columnist is you get carried away by your own kind of eloquence and you sort of follow the thread perhaps beyond where it should go. And I think you're right. But look, what I'm trying to do as a columnist is so many people come up to me, and especially in the last 7 months, and have said to me, "You keep me sane." I'm writing for them. I feel it's like, well, I haven't taken a vacation.
Because the rest of us, we're feeling gaslit by everybody else.
Right, exactly. And people have said, you're my weekly dose of a sense that I haven't lost my mind, that use other words. Mm-hmm. So that is actually what I'm trying to do, is not simply, persuade the rabid college student that she's wrong or he's wrong. I'm trying to provide, what I think I can do if I have a gift is to provide a set of ideas, reminders, and language that allow people who are Jewish or not on my side of the argument to express themselves. Because I think many of us feel like we are in a blizzard. We're dealing with a kind of a blizzard of half-truths and propaganda in what's going on currently. And, I've said elsewhere that the job of the reporter is to reveal, the job of the columnist is to remind. I'm trying to remind readers of things that they should know. I don't think I can fight anti-Semitism, but let me put it in a different way. I've been going to a lot of college campuses. I went to Amherst, I was at Harvard the other day, Stanford, but the most interesting visit, if I may say, was to Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction, Colorado. Not a lot of Jews. But it was an audience that was at least neutral and probably philo-Semitic or philo-Semitically inclined. And I think where there is a real upside for us is in this broad, giant middle that doesn't have the language, is certainly not opposed to us, and wants to understand, well, what's actually going on. And I think that's where the battle, it's not joining the battle, you're not fighting the anti-Semites, at least directly. What you're doing is you're trying to remind, I think, a majority of Americans that if we were a country that were to turn on its Jewish citizens or its Jewish allies abroad, we would not be America. I wrote this essay for Sapir the other day. The first Jew to graduate from Harvard was in 1720. The first Jew to die in the service of American independence was in 1776. We were there from the beginning. You look at the motto of Yale, you look at the towns the Puritans named in Massachusetts, they were profoundly conscious of a Hebraic heritage which richly informs everything that makes America what it is. I love that line in Washington's letter to the Newport congregation. We don't speak of tolerance anymore, right? Mere toleration, I think was his phrase. So if Christian America were to essentially ignore anti-Semitism, they would be traducing the traditions of American life that have made this country great. And what goes for Jews ultimately also goes for other minorities. So everything that we value in America is caught up in this question of the new tide in anti-Semitism. And to fight, we fight against, or we oppose anti-Semitism, right, because we're Jews, and it's our necks that are on the line. But there's a larger set of interests at stake, and our allies are anyone, whether they're Latino or black or whatever, our allies are anyone who believe in those foundational values that made this country a good place to live and raise a family.
Beautiful. So in the spirit of, I appreciate that you're writing these columns in many ways to give language to people who, I think in many ways agree with you, or who need the language for articulating this position we're in. And I appreciate that. But in the spirit of the challenge of the other side, which you've talked about and which we started this conversation, I think there are real things that we need to grapple with that are not going well in Israel, or that are not all being handled, I think, the way that many of us would want to see it handled. And I wonder about the challenge of, have you ever thought about writing that article of, what they're protesting that we have to really grapple with? And I don't mean the protesters on campus. I just mean more just in general, these, the issues that people have worried about, from the far-right government that's in place now, worries about leadership and Netanyahu's leadership, and just really grappling with the things that actually are needed to be grappled with around this war.
The easy answer is, well, if Bibi just left, things would be so much better. I'm
not sure it would be that different in terms of how they're handling the war, but it would probably feel more trust.
This is I don't know, because I was editor of the Jerusalem Post when Arik Sharon was prime minister, and he was the most hated man in the world. Older people will remember when Menachem Begin was the worst person in the world. You can go to Rabin at some point, Paris at some point. Whoever's leader of Israel is going to be hated by the people who are determined to hate Israel. And so whatever our misgivings on a particular leader, it's not going to alleviate the problem, the large problem that we're grappling with. Obviously, different leaders, somewhat different policies, and I have my own preferences, and I've expressed myself. But I don't want to play the game, right? Of it's all very much a shame, but it's sort of our fault because we have this, right-wing government in Israel and this, obnoxious leader, right? 40% of France voted for an outright fascist, right? Marine Le Pen. In Israel, yes, it's regrettable and embarrassing. 10% of the country voted for the Ben-Gvir faction. But 40% voted for Marine Le Pen in France, and we don't spend our time talking about impending fascism in France. There is a right-wing quasi-fascist party in power in Sweden. When was the last time you're like, I am boycotting Sweden, right? Because, why would IKEA is out. Kids, go to West Elm. It's more expensive. I don't know where West Elm is from, but hopefully not Sweden, right? So it's a kind of a uniquely sort of Jewish thing. Well, the fault is sort of partially ours. Now, I am perfectly happy, and we should be having muscular debates about elements of Israeli policy which are, in my view, self-defeating, wrong-headed, contrary to the long-term interests of Zionism. And I'm on record as saying that the purpose of Zionism is Jewish self-rule. It's so that others don't rule over us, but also for us not to rule over others. But then you get to the more vexing question of, well, how do we do that? How does Israel do that without committing national suicide in the process? Because, you have a situation in which Israel's life has been interlocked with Palestinian life in the way Siamese twins are locked together. And you don't just chop it down the middle and say, well, let's see what happens. It's a delicate thing. But ultimately, there is this kind of, if I may say, a certain kind of Jewish reflex, which would like to feel at least 40% guilty. And I think that is a real mistake, particularly now, particularly when the sons and daughters of our cousins in Israel are going into harm's way every single day, not just by being in Gaza, but by being in shooting distance of Gaza or being in shooting distance of Lebanon. And there are moments when it behooves us as a vibrant and thoughtful Jewish community to understand the full meaning of solidarity. We had it for Soviet Jews in the 1970s and 1980s. We should have it for Israeli Jews in this decade. What Hamas intended on October 7th was the annihilation of not just a state, but of a people. If they had had an October 8th and an October 9th and an October 10th, it would have continued in exactly the same vein. And if we have reached a point where we don't understand that, then there's something really the matter with the Jewish community. That is work that we really have to undertake within the Jewish community to say what they intended and what they filmed on their GoPro cameras was the complete extermination of the Jews. Bear that in mind.
There is so much more I want to ask you, but I'm going to give some of these questions to our community as well. I think this particular moment, how do you understand this particular moment in American history, in politics, and in particular, how do you think what is happening in Israel and then the subsequent kind of response here in the States will impact this election? Knowing you're not a prophet, but that just your sense of like what you're seeing.
Like that because then in 5 months or 6 months you'll be like, oh well,
Okay, how about what are you seeing so far in terms of the way it's impacting? Because it's already impacting, I think, what we're seeing.
I'm not sure the impact is so great. I mean, the Biden and the White House seems to think that the most important thing is to make sure that they win Michigan. They're not going to lose the election because of Michigan. And they're not going to lose the election because of Gaza. And they're not going to lose the election because kids on campus are mad. They're going to lose it for inflation, immigration, worries about the economy, the usual set of issues. I think I saw and might have even cited in a recent column that even for 18 to 29-year-olds, the Israel-Palestine question was number 15 on their list. Now, it'll be interesting to me within the Jewish community to see whether Biden's apparent turn on Israel shifts votes. But I suspect the impact is going to be really limited. Maybe the Jewish vote will go from 80% Biden to 67% Biden, but don't hold me to any of this. I'm happy to talk about what's going to happen in 100 years when we're all dead, right? But 6 months, that's a bad question.
What do you think is going to happen? Yeah. I think we'll still be here. Frank Bruni has described our interactions as centered on grievances, that everyone's grievances should be ascendant. And so there are different groups that sort of say we can't, we have some kind of moral high ground because of the grievances we have had. How do we talk about this? And when we have genuine, also real grievances that have come out of October 7th, how do we not play into that, I guess, that victimization role, even though they were truly victimized?
And we were victimized, but the question here is not who's the bigger victim. The question is justice. And the question is, how do we bring this to the best possible end? When we play the victimization game, then it becomes, 1,200 Israelis were killed, but tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed, so they're the bigger victim, and so therefore, you Jews should chill out or whatever. That I think is a mistake, and Frank's a very dear friend. I think his entire thesis is extremely well taken. I mean, I worry about a culture that we seem to have developed in the United States in which he who is offended immediately has the moral upper hand. And so the easiest thing to do to acquire that upper hand is to say, I'm offended. The right response to saying you're offended is to say, well, tell me why, right? Not, I'm so sorry, how can I allay you or assuage your offense? We would have a much more robust and healthy, we would develop, as my friend said, the habits of a free mind if the answer to our grievance culture was to say, well, let's talk and don't be so precious and take yourself a little less seriously. Maybe that would do something to lower the temperatures, and that goes for us too. Look, at some point, we Jews are going to start joking about it. It's just a matter of time. Maybe it's going to be a few years, but I mean, the standard joke: they tried to kill us, let's eat. I mean, it's a bit of a shop-worn joke, but it's supposed to be funny.
If you've been watching the Israeli show Eretz Nehederet, they're already joking about all of it. I mean, not joking. It's a kind of coping mechanism, I think, and it's actually very powerful. And is somewhat transcendent to be able to sort of
look. Humor is the antidote to everything that corrodes the soul. And I think one of the secrets of Jewish endurance has been this fascination with humor, fascination with a certain kind of a sense of that there ought to be levity in life. So
that's right.
I mean, I have some jokes to tell you now, but they're all...
You want to just give us just one?
On the margin.
No. Okay. Eretz Nehederet is the Israeli SNL, basically. I want to, before we have to close, and I have so many more questions here and here that I didn't get to ask that I wish I could, but I'm so appreciative of the richness of this conversation. Since this is kicking off our Hineni series, what do you think it means to be a good Jewish American citizen today? What would that look like?
The big question. Look, you're actually, I get to rehearse what I said earlier, which is that the first part is to remind ourselves that those foundational American values that I spoke of earlier are the best expression, not just of an American value, but I think of our participation as Jews in American life. And the second point, also one I made earlier, is the importance of deep Jewish pride, of feeling that this inheritance that we lucked into is it's fundamental to our sense of selves to nurture it in the ways in the ways that we can. I would add a third one, and this has just been on my mind because in the course of my conversation with Gail, it kind of plopped out of my brain and onto the page, which is, Rabbi Hillel's injunction, where there are no men, be thou a man or woman.
We just say mensch. And then it covers it.
Better,
There we go, yeah.
better.
That's what he said, literally.
And I mean that in the sense of my, people will say, oh, you're so courageous. I don't feel courageous. Like, Noam Tibon rescuing his grandchildren on October 7th, that's courage. Writing a column in the Times with my dog at my feet is not courage. But I am trying to uphold a set of values that are profoundly informed by who I am as a Jew, and do that in every interaction with every other human being. The most important ones not being public, but in fact private. And that, I think, to some extent, answers the question. But it's a big question you're asking, and I'm not sure I have like a Jonathan Sachs
I might
type
get to
answer.
end with your words, but words that I just found were so powerful. You were in a column with Gail, you were talking about all these graduation speeches, and you kind of gave like your Cliff Notes version of what you would say if you were giving a graduation speech. And in many ways, it also answers this question in my mind. And it feels deeply Jewish, not just because you throw in the word Hineni, which I swear was not why we picked the name of the series, but you just said it anyway. But you said, I'd urge them to do everything they can to cultivate an inner life, especially since social media is always trying to suck it out of them. Commit great poems to heart. Compose dirty limericks in your head. Read more for pleasure, less for purpose. Don't post self-indulgent glam shots of yourself on Instagram. Also, think of TikTok as your generation's cocaine and get off it. Work hard on keeping a few good friendships, not gaining thousands of followers. Eschew envy, cynicism, and virtue signaling. Ponder the meaning of the word Hineni. Make only enough money so that you don't have to think about it much. Preserve an independence of mind and spirit and nurture a contrarian opinion or two, especially if it goes against your own political side. Reserve the right to change your mind and really do it from time to time. Never join a cause if you aren't fully familiar with the argument against it. Heed the words of Rabbi Hillel, where there are no men, be thou a man or woman. Don't equate success with fame or fame with happiness. Find your core satisfaction in a soulmate, not a career. Laugh more, mostly at yourself. Well, I think that is a pretty good answer to what it is to be a good Jewish American citizen.
Do I get to tell one rabbi joke?
Oh yeah, please.
Okay.
I gotta laugh at myself too, please.
So this rabbi is a golf addict, and it's Yom Kippur, and he just can't help himself. So at 6 a.m, he's on the green for 9 holes. And first shot, a hole in one. In heaven, Moses looks at the Almighty and says, how are you allowing this to happen? The Almighty shrugs. Says, it's okay. And then second shot, birdie. Moses is just beside himself. How can you allow this to happen on this day of all days? The Almighty shrugs. Third shot, an eagle. Moses is really furious, and finally the Almighty looks at him and says, yeah? Who's he going to tell?
I like that. Well, if you're going to do a rabbi joke, I'm going to do one more too.
Okay.
All right, so there's a rabbi, and his whole life, all he's wanted to do was just eat a little succulent pig. And so he finally goes to Hawaii, where this is a specialty, and there's no one from his congregation around. So he orders a big, full, succulent pig, which is roasted on the pit, and they come and they present it and put it in front of him on a big platter. It's like got the greens around it, this big pig, the snout, everything, and in its mouth is like a green apple, and he just cannot believe, he starts salivating, and suddenly he's about to dig in when he hears behind him, Rabbi Rosenthal. And he goes, can you believe you order an apple in this place and they make such a fuss? Okay. All right, so anyway, not that I would ever do that. Okay, so I'm glad we can end on a little humor, and I do think actually it is not just incidental to our survival. Maybe that's part of our campaign for 10% Jewier. Tell a couple of jokes. That's actually a David Moore specialty as well. But I think more than that, you've given us a lot of deep food for thought and challenged us to continue thinking. I didn't agree with everything you said today. I'm happy about that. I think that but I agree on more. But I do think that we need to continue to be in this engagement. And what's at stake is not just our own viewpoints. This is actually our muscle of engaging each other, especially across lines of difference. This is how we will preserve our own liberal democracy. I really think that that's more of what's at stake. So this is just a taste of the series. I'm going to pass this off to Rabbi Joy Levitt, who will tell us just a few words to close us out. Thank you. I have to turn it on. The top there.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. At the conclusion of every one of our Hineni programs, we will celebrate how many postcards Central Synagogue members and neighbors have written to get out the vote. That's really a big focus of ours, and I'm proud to say that as of tonight, that number is 3,565. Central members, you can get involved by checking your email after this event to join our Hineni civic engagement group on Central Square, which is an online platform where you can learn about action opportunities, as well as continue conversations with other Central members after our events. Our neighbors can join the voting rights group on Mighty Networks. Please join our clergy for a 6-part series beginning with Rabbi Mosalth on Tuesday, June 4th, as we look at American sacred texts, and we study them in the same way that we study Jewish sacred texts. These are texts that have inspired our democracy. All the registration information can be found on the website. As you have heard, Bret Stephens is the editor-in-chief of Sapir, and they have graciously provided some copies of the latest journal. I, too, encourage you to take them. I don't think they're enough for everybody, but if you'd like one, they are in the back as you leave. Have a wonderful evening.